You know, I have quite a few Pokemon figures, from Jessie to James to even Kotobukiya's red figure, but none of them are really posable. It's been a long time since I collected Pokemon toys, but I think I'm ready to do it again. Some time ago you may remember the D-Arts figures that came out. Yes, that's right, I wound up getting the Mewtwo figure, but strangely enough you'll see that this is actually an SHfiguarts figure. What's funny about this is I've called the Mega Man X D-Arts figure an SHfiguarts figure before. Little did I know, Tamashii Nations would eventually merge the two brands, D-Arts and Figuarts, into the same line. And from what I understand, Mewtwo was originally released as a D-Arts figure. But now time has passed and Mewtwo has been re-released under the SHfiguarts brand. If you take a look at the box here, you'll notice they say this is the Arts Remix. I'm not quite sure if that's some sort of signifier of this being the newer version, but it's there. As you can see, there's some Tamashii Nations logos right there, as well as the Bandai logo, showing that yes, this is all under the Bandai brand. And so far, I'm actually really satisfied with this box design. It's much simpler than some of the other ones, but it's stylish enough to really pop as something new. I love the windowed display. It does show an additional head in there, and of course the figure itself looking great. The art of Mewtwo on the box is really satisfying to look at, but it's done in a softer tone, so it doesn't dominate what you're looking at. Your eye is drawn to the figure. The white and purple color scheme is a great touch, and it really does add to the color scheme of the Pokemon itself. On the side here, we have a very stylish SHfiguarts logo, as well as Mewtwo Arts Remix again, with a little image of him. On the back, Mewtwo is shown in several poses, and additionally with his accessory of what I can only assume is his Psychic Attack. The other side is adorned with a big Pokeball and some additional branding there, as well as his name. But that's pretty much all there is to it. Not much else to see here but a nice little logo on the bottom. And without further ado, why don't we just open this thing up? And when you open it, this is all you get. And honestly, it's completely straight to the point, and I love this. This is all you need. Every accessory is right here to the right of the figure. The figure is of course there, and the stand is in the bottom of the plastic. And out of the box, this figure looks absolutely amazing. The whole figure is covered in almost like a matte finish. Nothing is too smooth or too shiny. This thing just looks good and it feels amazing to touch. I have a couple other SHfiguarts and they all seem pretty decent as far as texture goes, but some of them are a little bit shinier than I would like for them to be. This one honestly feels great, and ultimately I think that his joints and everything look really good. Despite how posable he is and how many joints he does have, nothing is too jarring, and I was really worried about this tail because on the box it looks terrible. But in person, it actually doesn't look bad at all. Maybe on camera it looks a little bit weirder and the segments do show up a little bit more, but ultimately when you look at him like this, that tail hardly really shows at all. But of course it's posable and you can do what you need to with it. Overall, the sculpt on this thing is perfect. There's really nothing more to want out of a Mewtwo figure. He has those big, thick, creamy thighs, that big old tail, that Frieza-looking body, and that paleness of his flesh is just incredibly satisfying to look at. The only thing that I could say so far that I don't like is on his head. It's just barely showing up on camera, but there's a very small part of him that looks almost like it's scratched. It's just an area where the finish seems to have been worn a little bit, and it's a little jarring when you really get up close, so I hope this isn't something that happens to all the figures, but it sure as hell did happen to mine. But now that we have him out of the box, let's go ahead and try to pose him a little bit. He's got a lot of really responsive joints, which I really like about this. Sorry to bring it up again, but the Mega Man X D-Arts figure that I have is incredibly hard to pose. Over time, the joints got really weak, and ultimately, they just weren't as cooperative as I'd like them to be. But so far, what I'm seeing from Mewtwo is that his joints are actually incredibly firm. They're not tight, but they're firm enough to the point where they're not going to loosen, and he's not going to start falling over. They do what you want them to do when you pose him. You don't have to use much force, which is great because you never feel like you're going to break him. But even so, his quality is so high that I feel like you'd have a hard time doing that anyway. Now this design does use a couple of ball joints. In his shoulder, you may not be able to see it, but he does have a ball joint in there, which allows a nice rotation of his arm. It can go in and out as well. And there's a little segment right here where you can see he can swivel his arm just beneath the shoulder, which is really helpful because it lets him do a lot more. This just alone looks awesome. But then we have that hinged elbow, which is a very primitive joint, but ultimately it works. You don't need this thing to rotate too much because the elbow doesn't really work that way naturally. So this looks fine on a figure that's a living thing. On a robot, I could see this being a ball joint, but On a figure like this, it makes sense for it to be a hinge. I'm just playing with this and it's already looking awesome. Let's move down to his wrist, which is a ball joint where his hand connects. This one's a little bit looser, but ultimately it's not like he's holding a gun or a sword or anything like that. So it actually works pretty well. And each of these fingers are little tiny ball joints. That's actually awesome. I really don't get posable fingers very often on figures, and when I do, I gush about it because it's just super useful. His head is also on a ball joint, a rather big one, so it can of course swivel and it can roll around, it can go up and down, and that's pretty much it. Now the only problem is that he has that small stem connecting his back to the back of his head, so that can be a bit of a problem. And as you can see, there's a double joint here. There's another segment where his head connects to his neck and where his neck connects to his upper body. This also does move just a little bit, but doesn't really seem like it has much purpose. Ultimately, the tubing comes right out, so if it's giving you too much problem, you could actually go without it and still get some more freedom out of him, and then maybe just plug that back in when you're ready to pose him the way that you want. His upper body has a segment right here which allows him to turn with his chest, and of course that can be rotated and rolled around. It gets a nice little motion that is a ball joint, and his waist, I'm assuming, is another ball joint because it gets rotation and it rolls around and you can swivel it. And it's all great. His legs, of course, those big old thick thighs of his, are on a ball joint, which allow them to rotate just slightly. He can get a kick upward, and he can, of course, kick back. And he can't really kick out too far. That's about as far as you're getting, but again, this is Mewtwo. He's not going to be karate kicking. He's going to be shooting you in the face with a psychic blast. Finally, he has, I guess you would consider this a knee. Well, either way, this is like, what are these called? Like digigrade or digitigrade or something like that, as far as like a furry, like cat people have these same kind of feet. So I guess that's almost an ankle. God, it's really squeaky. But still, the joint is incredibly responsive. Oh, that kills my soul. And then his toe even has a little bit of movement there. It can swivel. It's on a little tiny ball joint, I think, as well. This weird sort of knee thing is actually a ball peg joint. So it can swivel at either side of the ball, and then it just kind of gets a bend for the way that it's shaped. Now, finally, his tail is quite a few segments, as you can see, which is pretty darn amazing. The figure itself is about 5 inches tall, whereas his tail is a whopping 6.5 inches long. That's pretty crazy. And of course, each segment has a ball joint, which allows it to pose rather freely. It's incredible how well this tail poses. It's really surprising and nice. It's really responsive and really easy to pose too. You hardly feel any of those joints moving, but it holds whatever shape you put it in, which is awesome. You could potentially use that tail to pose him without a stand, which is a nice feature. But of course, he does come with a stand. The stand is similar to other Bandai figures in which it is a base, of course, with a 3-point hinged stand and a bit of a grabber hand at the end of the stand there. This works just fine. I typically prefer a peg to go into the back of the figure, but ultimately this is okay too. And while the stand can support his weight, it is just a little hard to operate. I mean, it works, but unfortunately at certain angles, his bottom half is so heavy that he might lean back, and that's kind of hard to avoid. So you're going to probably want him to have his feet on the floor, or you're going to have to pose him in a way that shifts his weight, so if he's floating, he doesn't look incredibly goofy. Still, the figure looks absolutely amazing. I'm really loving him so far, and he only comes with a few accessories, so there's really not much more to talk about. Besides the new pose, do you recognize any new accessories I attached to him? No? Well, maybe if I turn him, it'll be a little easier. No still? Well, it's incredibly subtle, that's why. If you really look at Mewtwo's face here, you can see that he's looking straight ahead, whereas the original head he came with is actually looking to the side. It's a very simple change, but it does really make his expression all the better. And what's even better is that he doesn't have that strange little spot on his head like the other one does, so I'm happy to see that. Though I will say the way that you detach his head does make me a little nervous in regards to swapping this part out. First, you take the little tube out of the back of his head. Simple enough. But then, you just kind of have to pop his head off. That reveals this weird little peanut here, and that just plugs like a ball into the bottom of his head socket. And while that does work, I feel like over time that could be a problem. If you're swapping the part too often, that's going to wear down that ball. It's not worth deducting points, sure, but it's just minor things like that that can overall kind of sully the experience with the figure. I'll likely leave this face on him anyway, so I don't really want to complain too much, but still, these are criticisms that need to be expressed. Now don't blink, because I'm going to add another accessory to the figure. Can you tell what it was? Again, this one is very subtle like the other. But of course this one has a purpose. As you can see, his hand is a little bit different. This hand, however, has a small peg on it, which of course is for a purpose. That part allows him to hold this amazing accessory. That hand will allow him to hold this amazing FX part. This demonic-looking eyeball is, of course, the psychic attack that he comes with. It's actually a pretty simple fitting, too. When you take it off, I'm not sure if it'll show up well on camera, but there's a very small hole right there. That allows that small peg on his hand to plug in, and then you can do with it what you like. And this is what it's all about here. This ties the whole thing together. This part is beautiful, and it's really lightweight. It's this nice clear plastic, and it doesn't weigh him down when he's holding it, unlike some other FX parts I have for other figures. So this thing really, really ties everything together, and honestly, it's of course the best accessory he comes with, because that's pretty much everything he comes with. Though, yet again, this is another part where you have to basically unplug it with just brute force, and that ball joint comes out, and that allows you to then plug on the next piece. So then, with all the details of the figure out of the way, what exactly do I think of it? Well, in all honesty, I actually really love this figure. I had admired the Mewtwo D-Arts figure for a long time, but it was really hard to justify purchasing it because the D-Arts figures exploded in value. Now that Figuarts has come along and re-released them, and I'm assuming improved them even, I was very happy to buy this figure at a $50 price tag. I'd say for $45–50, this is an absolute steal. This figure is wonderful. From the way it feels in hand, to the way it looks, to the paint apps, to even the way it's sculpted, everything here just works. One thing I was really afraid of were the joints. I was afraid that they were going to be way too obtuse and they were going to show way too much. Sometimes joints can really cut into the smoothness of a figure, and they can really ruin the flow of it. Somehow with a design as smooth as Mewtwo's, the joints really don't bother me. Another great thing about this figure is that it was really nice to pose. One problem that I usually have when I'm making these reviews is that it takes a long time to pose and take pictures of a figure. I had no such problem with Mewtwo. All of his joints are incredibly responsive, and he holds poses really well. The one thing I'll say that was bad was his stand. His stand makes it a little hard to pose him, but once you play with his feet long enough, you can figure it out, and it works rather well. Mewtwo is one of my very favorite Pokemon. As a kid, I was obsessed with Mewtwo after I saw that movie. He was such a badass in it, and he was doing what looked like the Kamehameha from Dragon Ball Z, so that was all I needed to be sold. And until this day, I've loved Mewtwo. They've done so much with him, and he's always been that original god status legendary character. He really feels important, and they've always made him seem important going forward. It's really great to see him again. To see him done such good justice with an awesome figure like this really warms my heart as an old school Pokemon fan. And finally, I'll give this figure a very solid 9 out of 10. The only reason I won't give him a 10 out of 10 is because, well, he didn't really come with enough. For some reason, I was expecting more. Especially owning other D-Arts and Figuarts figures, I felt like he was missing accessories. He really only comes with an additional head, his additional hand that allows him to adapt his FX part, and the stand, if you want to count it. So if they maybe included a little more, I would have given him a 10, but ultimately, I'm really happy with the way he turned out for only $50. So if you're a classic Pokemon fan, or if you just love Mewtwo, go out and get this figure, because it's really worth the purchase. Thank you so much for watching. If you did like this video, please make sure to leave a like. What do you think about Mewtwo? Is he as cool as I make him seem? Would you rather have this figure or the Charizard, Blastoise, or Venusaur figures? Comment below. Make sure to subscribe because I'm always releasing new figure reviews every week, and hit the bell so that you get notified when I do it so you don't miss anything. Finally, I'm going to link a video on screen, which is Weeaboo Wednesday. If you watch it, I do a poll in the beginning of what figure I should review next. You could always comment with what you want me to review. I'll see you folks in the next video, have an awesome weekend, and keep on collecting.